At 1:38 p.m., a Boeing 787 Dreamliner lifted off from Mumbai's Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel International Airport, headed for London. It had only minutes left to live. Less than 60 seconds later, it plummeted to the ground with over 240 souls on board, smashing into the dormitory of a medical college and setting off an inferno that could be seen across the city. And within hours, another fire had ignited, not in the sky, but inside boardrooms, regulatory agencies, and legal chambers around the world. Because this wasn't just a tragedy. This was a collapse of trust in what was once considered the crown jewel of modern aviation, the Boeing 787 Dreamliner. What investigators found in the wreckage, and more importantly, what they found missing, has sent shockwaves through the entire aviation industry. From failing engines to a suspicious loss of power and a cockpit that went silent far too soon, the story unfolding behind closed doors is one Boeing never wanted you to hear. But now, the evidence is too loud to ignore. And this time, not even billions in silence money will make it go away. Is Boeing finally facing the reckoning it escaped after the 737 MAX disaster? And is Air India just collateral damage, or complicit in hiding something much darker? This is the story behind the headlines, and it's one that could change the future of air travel forever. The Boeing 787 was never supposed to crash. Not like this. Designed to be one of the safest aircraft in history, the Dreamliner was built to handle engine failures, electrical glitches, and even lightning strikes. But on June 12, 2025, Flight AI 171 didn't just fail, it disintegrated before reaching 500 feet. The data recovered from the black boxes revealed something unprecedented. Both General Electric engines lost thrust simultaneously during takeoff, a scenario so rare it was never even fully simulated. As the aircraft clawed into the sky, security cameras captured a sudden plume of smoke and dust erupting from the rear fuselage. Moments later, the ram air turbine, a device that deploys only when all electrical systems fail, was ejected mid-flight. That alone confirmed the unthinkable. Complete electrical failure had occurred before the pilots even had time to issue a mayday. A machine designed to fly halfway around the world had crumbled in under a minute. And yet, that's just where the questions begin. This wasn't the first time the Dreamliner had whispered warnings. Long before the fatal crash, Boeing had already been under scrutiny. Lithium-ion battery fires, fuel leaks, fuselage microcracks, and improperly forged titanium components had all surfaced, and then quietly disappeared into the fog of corporate spin. In 2021, Boeing halted deliveries of the 787 for over a year due to structural flaws in the fuselage joints. But what's more alarming is this: they kept selling the plane anyway. Then came the whistleblower. A former engineer who worked 17 years at Boeing's Charleston assembly line filed a 120-page report accusing the company of skipping crucial welding inspections, bonding components incorrectly, and using silicone to cover gaps that should never have existed. These weren't cosmetic issues. These were core structural vulnerabilities, flaws in the very bones of the aircraft. And now, one of those bones had snapped in flight. As the investigation dug deeper, another disturbing layer emerged, this time from the Indian side. According to leaked testimonies, at least 2 Air India engineers had submitted reports of unusually weak engine thrust on Dreamliners months before the crash. One was fired shortly after. Maintenance logs from the aircraft were mysteriously incomplete. Critical data was missing. Air India claimed a digital storage error, but investigators weren't buying it. Even more damning, the very aircraft that crashed had experienced engine issues earlier in 2025 on a Delhi-Frankfurt flight. Under international standards, that should have triggered enhanced monitoring protocols. Instead, the aircraft returned to regular service with no major checks, and was scheduled for a high-capacity international flight with no additional oversight. And when the tragedy finally struck, the airline's first response wasn't transparency. It was misdirection. Hypotheses of bad weather, claims of lightning strikes. But there was no lightning, and weather was completely stable. Only after the black box revelations did the airline change its story. Too late for the truth to outrun the spin. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Boeing's stock plunged 5% in a single day. On flight booking platforms and travel forums, Passengers began actively avoiding the 787. Airlines launched their own emergency inspections. The FAA was forced to re-audit not just the Dreamliner, but Boeing's entire quality control process, and whispers grew louder. Is the 787 the next 737 MAX? But the damage wasn't limited to Boeing. Air India, now under Tata's ambitious revival strategy, had built its future around the Dreamliner. With 33 Dreamliners in service, it formed the backbone of their long-haul network. London, Paris, New York, Sydney, all depended on this model. And now, that backbone was fractured. Passengers fled, media scrutiny exploded, and perhaps most dangerously, trust dissolved. Not just in one aircraft, but in an entire industry's ability to hold itself accountable. Just when it seemed the mystery couldn't deepen any further, forensic investigators found something astonishing. The locking mechanism of the captain's seat had failed. This wasn't speculation. It was embedded in the black box recording. In a precise moment, milliseconds before the engines dropped to idle, the cockpit microphone picked up a sharp metallic clunk, followed by a human grunt. That was the sound of the captain's seat sliding backward violently, and by instinct he reached forward to stabilize himself. But in doing so, his hand latched onto the throttles and dragged both to idle, cutting all thrust just 65 meters above the ground. This was no isolated design flaw. The very same seat model had been flagged years earlier in internal Boeing communications for its poor locking pin durability. The part had even been replaced 11 days before the crash, but the replacement had no stress testing, no verification, just a signature on a checklist. And the checklist? Signed off during a night shift by an underpaid contractor. The 787 is built to glide through the sky for 15 hours non-stop. Yet a $12 component brought it to its knees in seconds. And that raises a terrifying question. What else is Boeing willing to gamble on? The Dreamliner is marketed as one of the most technologically advanced aircraft in the world. But in this case, that technology did nothing to prevent catastrophe. The system knew the throttles were dropped to idle. It knew the plane was still under takeoff power requirements. And yet, no override activated. Why? Because Boeing's flight management software assumes pilot inputs are intentional, even in emergencies. That decision, embedded deep in the system's logic, was made to avoid overriding the pilot's authority. But in doing so, it created a dangerous blind spot. It treats human reflex like conscious intent. And on Air India 171, that reflex became a death sentence. Other manufacturers, like Airbus, use software that would have flagged and rejected the dual throttle drop at such a low altitude. But Boeing's philosophy was pilot first, an ideology that, while noble in theory, ignored the simple fact that humans are not perfect, especially when thrown backward in a cockpit mid-takeoff. It wasn't the software that failed. It was the arrogance of believing software should never step in. As the findings went public, countries around the world began raising red flags. The European Union Aviation Safety Agency, EASA, called for an immediate audit of all Dreamliner seats. Australia ordered emergency inspections. Japan grounded 3 Dreamliners after discovering inconsistencies in seat locking systems during routine maintenance. And in the United States, a group of senators began pushing for hearings on Boeing's post-737 MAX compliance practices. But it was India that took the most dramatic step. In an unprecedented move, the Directorate General of Civil Aviation, DGCA, revoked the airworthiness certificate of all 787s operating in Indian airspace until full technical audits were completed. This halted dozens of international routes and sent a clear message. The days of Boeing being untouchable were over. The aviation world had shifted. This wasn't just a company under fire. It was a paradigm collapse, a moment where regulators and consumers alike stopped assuming safety was guaranteed just because a logo said so. Behind every data point, every checklist, every system failure, there were lives, mothers, daughters, students, grandparents, people who boarded a flight believing in something bigger than themselves, in human progress, in global connection, in the miracle of flight. And they were betrayed. The true cost of the crash isn't measured in lawsuits or stock price drops. It's measured in the silence of those who never landed, in the empty seats at family tables, in the birthdays that will never be celebrated. And it's measured in the growing awareness that this tragedy wasn't the product of a single catastrophic event, but of a culture of denial. At Boeing, at Air India, in the regulatory corridors that looked the other way. Because when trust is broken at 30,000 feet, it doesn't just fall, it shatters. When a machine as majestic as the Boeing 787 falls from the sky in less than a minute, it sends more than shockwaves through the aviation industry. It sends a signal that somewhere, somehow, someone looked away. From the moment the captain's seat betrayed him to the instant both engines obeyed a command that was never truly given, Air India 171 became a symbol of what happens when silence is cheaper than safety. This wasn't just about a pin, or a throttle, or a seat. It was about a system that chose efficiency over inspection, loyalty over logic, and branding over accountability. The Dreamliner was sold as the aircraft of the future. But now, for thousands of families, it's the ghost of a promise broken in mid-air. And Boeing? They've weathered storms before. But this time, the questions are louder, the evidence clearer, and the anger global. If this tragedy does not change aviation standards, if no one is held accountable, if this fades into yet another forgotten crash report, then what was the point of the black box speaking at all? If this truth hit you like it did us, don't stay silent. Subscribe to uncover the stories hidden behind headlines. Turn on notifications, because the next flight you take might depend on what they're not telling you. Share this video with anyone who travels, who trusts, who boards a plane thinking the system has their back. And tell us in the comments, should Boeing be forced to ground the Dreamliner until every flaw is fixed? Or is this just another corporate escape route in disguise?